The weight of 9 languages, Manny Pacquiao once said, is heavier than any championship belt I've ever carried. The crystal chandeliers of the Burj Al Arab ballroom cast fractured light across a sea of white dish-dashers and designer gowns, each worth more than what his mother earned in a lifetime of washing clothes. Manny tugged at his borrowed tuxedo collar, feeling the fabric constrict around his throat like a fighter's clinch he couldn't escape. This Dubai charity gala represented everything his childhood in General Santos was not: excess, comfort, and the casual cruelty of those who had never known hunger. The air itself seemed perfumed with privilege, thick with oud and expensive champagne, while conversations swirled in Arabic, English, and French around him like he was invisible. Servers in crisp uniforms glided past with golden trays, their eyes sliding over him without recognition, as if 8 world titles meant nothing in a room measuring worth only in oil fortunes and inherited wealth. He was a guest, yes, but the kind of guest that made people whisper and wonder why the organizers had invited a man whose hands were built for violence, not violin concertos. The marble floor beneath his feet cost more than his first gym in Manila, and he thought of his trainer's words, "Different ring, same fight." Manny positioned himself near a towering window, overlooking the Persian Gulf, the water black and infinite under the night sky, dotted with the lights of yachts he could never afford despite his millions. Here, among Arab millionaires whose wealth came from earth and ancestry rather than blood and sweat, he was merely Manny the boxer, a curiosity piece, entertainment that once danced for cameras. They knew his fists but not his heart, his record but not his journey, his face but not the 9 languages sleeping on his tongue like coiled serpents. A group of men in traditional dress stood near the auction display, their laughter rolling across the ballroom like thunder before a storm. One of them, tall and sharp-featured with a beard trimmed to geometric perfection, caught Manny's eye and smiled, but it was the smile of a predator spotting prey. The man began walking toward him, trailed by an entourage, and Manny felt his champion's instinct awaken. The fight was about to begin. Khaled arrived with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything, his white dish-dasher pristine as untouched snow, diamond cufflinks catching the light like miniature galaxies. "Manny Pacquiao," he announced, his English polished by Oxford but sharpened with condescension, "the fighting senator from the Philippines. Tell me, how does one discuss economic policy when your vocabulary is limited to jabs and hooks?" Some entourage behind him chuckled, a rehearsed chorus that knew their role. Manny stood motionless, his fighter's composure holding steady even as something ancient stirred in his chest, the memory of every dismissal he had ever received for being poor, brown, small. Khaled circled him slowly, performing for the growing audience of silk-draped observers. "Perhaps you can negotiate trade agreements through pantomime, or maybe the Philippine Congress communicates entirely through boxing metaphors." The laughter grew louder now, spreading through the ballroom like a contagion, though several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing cruelty dressed in humor's clothing. "Come now, our champion," Khaled continued, his voice dripping with false warmth. "Surely you must have opinions on international business, on global finance, on matters beyond which corner your trainer shouts from." He switched seamlessly to French, then Arabic, making a theatrical show of his linguistic prowess while his eyes remained cold and calculating. Manny watched him perform, reading the man's movements like he read opponents in the ring. The overextension of ego, the unguarded arrogance, the assumption of victory before the first bell. This was a man who had never been challenged by someone he considered beneath him. Khaled leaned closer, his breath mint-sharp and invasive. "Or perhaps you prefer we speak in the only language you truly understand. Violence," the word hung in the perfumed air like a challenge, like a thrown glove in an ancient duel, and Manny felt the weight of his entire country on his shoulders. Every Filipino worker in Dubai who had been dismissed, every domestic helper whose intelligence was ignored, every construction worker whose humanity was questioned, they were all standing with him now. The marble floor beneath his feet became the cracked concrete of his childhood streets, where tourists had spoken words he collected like precious stones. Khaled straightened, confident in his dominance, already turning to accept congratulations from his followers for this public humiliation. But Manny's hand moved to his heart in a gesture of respect, his lips parting to release not anger, but something far more devastating: understanding. The room held its breath, sensing the shift like animals before an earthquake, waiting for the champion to respond. "Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh," Manny began, his Arabic flowing like water over ancient stone, each syllable pronounced with the careful precision of someone who had learned not from privilege, but from passion. The effect was instantaneous. Khaled's smirk froze mid-expression, his face transforming into a mask of disbelief as the words continued. "Ana uhib hada, al-lugha li tajmil alathi tamiluha," Manny said softly, explaining that he loved the language for the beauty it carried within its consonants and vowels. The entourage behind Khaled fell silent, their rehearsed laughter dying in their throats, like candles snuffed by an unexpected wind. Around them, the ballroom seemed to contract, drawing every person closer to this impossible moment where the dismissed fighter spoke the language of their heritage with respect and understanding. Khaled's diamond cufflinks no longer sparkled. They seemed dull against the brilliance of what was unfolding. Manny continued in Arabic, his voice carrying the weight of genuine reverence as he quoted Al-Ghazali, the ancient Islamic philosopher whose words about knowledge and humility had crossed centuries to find voice in this unlikely speaker. "Seeking knowledge is obligatory upon every Muslim," he recited, then added in his own words how this teaching had inspired him to see learning as sacred, not as currency for superiority. The elderly Arab guests began nodding, recognition dawning in their eyes. This was not performative knowledge, not the shallow recitation of someone trying to impress. This was the speech of a student who had sat humbly at the feet of wisdom, who had approached their culture not as a tourist but as a pilgrim. Khaled's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, a fish suddenly, finding itself on unfamiliar shore, drowning in air that had always sustained him. "I learned your beautiful language." Manny switched to English now, his accent carrying the music of Manila, but his meaning crystal clear. "Because when I fought in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, I wanted to thank my Arab fans in words their hearts could feel." His eyes met. Khaled's directly, without anger, without triumph, only with the quiet dignity of someone who had climbed from nothing to stand as equal among any man. The Filipino champion's hand remained over his heart, that gesture of respect never wavering, even as the power dynamic in the room shifted completely. Every dismissive word Khaled had spoken now echoed back as testament to his own limitations, his own failure to see beyond the prison of his assumptions. The silence stretched like silk pulled taut across the ballroom, every eye fixed on the man they had underestimated just moments before. Manny's Arabic continued to flow, his words now turning to the concept of adab, the Islamic principle, of refinement and good character that transcends mere etiquette. He spoke of how this philosophy reminded him of the Filipino value of pakikipagkapwa-tao, the shared inner self that connects all humanity regardless of station or circumstance. His pronunciation carried the soft guttural sounds of classical Arabic, learned not in prestigious universities but in late-night sessions after brutal training days, when his body screamed for rest but his mind hungered for connection. The crystal chandeliers above seemed to dim their brilliance, as if even light itself wished to listen more closely to these unexpected pearls of wisdom falling from the lips of a champion who wore humility like armor. Khaled's face had transformed from arrogant certainty to ashen confusion, beads of perspiration forming at his temples despite the air-conditioned coolness of the venue. His companions, those who had laughed so readily at his mockery, now avoided his gaze, their own shame reflecting in the polished marble floors beneath their handcrafted Italian shoes. Manny continued speaking, his tone never rising to rebuke, never descending to gloating, only maintaining that steady warmth of someone sharing truth, rather than wielding it as weapon. He explained in Arabic how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had emphasized that no Arab was superior to a non-Arab except through righteousness and good action, his words a mirror held up to Khaled's prejudice without a single note of accusation. The wealthy Arab's designer suit suddenly looked like costume, his wealth reduced to mere decoration against the richness of knowledge and cultural respect that Manny wore invisibly. Around them, the gathering had become something closer to a sermon than a social event, guests leaning forward as if drawn by invisible threads to witness this quiet revolution of expectations. An elderly Emirati businessman in traditional kandura wiped tears from his weathered cheeks, moved beyond words by hearing his sacred language, honored by someone the world knew only for fighting. Manny's hand remained pressed over his heart throughout, that universal gesture of sincerity speaking louder than any translation, reminding everyone present that respect required no interpreter. The ballroom's opulence, the gold leaf, the imported roses, the tables laden with delicacies, faded into insignificance against the wealth of this moment, where a poor boy from General Santos stood taller than towers of accumulated money. Khaled's diamond cufflinks caught the light again, but now they seemed to wink in embarrassment at their owner's exposed poverty of spirit. Then, like a master musician changing keys mid-symphony, Manny shifted languages with such fluid grace that several guests gasped audibly at the transition. Spanish poured from his lips now, the rolling R's and melodic cadence carrying stories of his training camps in Mexico, where he had sparred with legends and shared meals with humble corner men who taught him their tongue between rounds. He spoke of early mornings in Guadalajara, where street vendors selling tamales became his tutors, trading language lessons for autographs, their weathered hands guiding his pronunciation while his taped fists hung heavy at his sides. The language of Cervantes transformed in his mouth into something earthier, more authentic, the Spanish of working people, of sacrifice, of dreams pursued in dusty gyms where glory wore sweat-stained clothing. His eyes softened with memory as he recounted how learning Spanish had allowed him to understand the psychology of his Mexican opponents, to hear their corner advice, to respect the warrior culture that had shaped so many of his greatest battles. Without pause, without flourish, he transitioned again, this time to Japanese, the sharp consonants and gentle vowels creating a completely different music in the stunned silence. Manny described his time training in Tokyo, where discipline reached spiritual dimensions, where every bow carried meaning, where language became inseparable from respect. He spoke of conversations with Japanese trainers who taught him that Bushido, the way of the warrior, shared kinship with the Filipino concept of lakas ng loob, courage that comes from the heart rather than the fist. His Japanese carried the formal politeness of someone who understood hierarchy not as superiority, but as cultural poetry, each honorific carefully placed like stones in a Zen garden. Khaled stood, frozen, his earlier confidence melting like ice sculptures under desert sun, while other Arab guests exchanged glances of profound reassessment. The ballroom had become a classroom where privilege learned humility, where assumptions crumbled before the evidence of dedication that transcended every boundary wealth could never purchase. Manny's smile remained gentle throughout, never triumphant, never cruel, the expression of someone sharing gifts rather than delivering punishment. He explained in English how each language represented not conquest but connection, bridges built word by word across the chasms that divided human experience. The ballroom's opulence dissolved in Manny's memory. As his eyes grew distant, traveling backward through decades to a place where crystal chandeliers existed only in impossible dreams. He was 8 years old again, barefoot on the cracked pavement of General Santos City's port district, where rust-stained cargo ships arrived carrying languages he didn't yet understand but desperately wanted to decode. Foreign sailors stumbled down gangplanks, speaking words that sounded like music from another planet. Arabic curves and Spanish rhythms, Japanese precision and Chinese tones blending into the humid air, thick with fish market smells and diesel fumes. Young Manny would crouch behind shipping containers, his stomach empty but his ears hungry, listening to conversations he couldn't comprehend, yet somehow knew held keys to worlds beyond the poverty that wrapped around his childhood like barbed wire. He collected discarded newspapers in foreign scripts, smoothing them flat like treasure maps, trading bottle caps and aluminum cans for used language books that tourists left behind at shabby hotels, their pages water-damaged but still legible enough to fuel his imagination. His mother found him one sweltering evening beneath their tin-roofed shanty's flickering kerosene lamp, lips moving silently as he sounded out Arabic phrases from a tattered phrasebook, his calloused fingers tracing words he'd copied onto cardboard scraps, scavenged from garbage bins. She wept quietly in the doorway, not understanding why her son, who barely had rice to eat, spent his precious energy on foreign tongues instead of rest. But Manny understood something she would only grasp years later. That language was the rope thrown to drowning men, that words could build ladders tall enough to climb, out of circumstances that fists alone could never escape. He listened to crackling radio broadcasts in languages he slowly, painfully decoded, his young mind creating pronunciation guides from the sounds of Japanese baseball games, Spanish telenovelas, Chinese news programs that scattered through the tropical night like seeds seeking fertile ground. By 12, he could greet sailors in 6 languages, trading his linguistic skills for stories of distant cities where poverty wasn't destiny. They told him about Manila, about Tokyo, about Mexico City, their words painting escape routes his feet would eventually follow. Those conversations became his first passport, his first visa to believing that a street kid from General Santos could someday stand among the world's elite, not as a curiosity, but as an equal. The memory dissolved like morning mist, and Manny's focus returned to the chandeliered ballroom where Khaled's confident smirk had transformed into stunned silence. Manny's voice shifted again, this time adopting the melodic tones of Mandarin, as he turned toward a Chinese businessman standing near the marble pillar, discussing Belt and Road initiatives and Manila's economic partnerships with Beijing, his pronunciation crisp enough that the man's eyebrows lifted in genuine surprise. Then came French, flowing like wine, as he addressed a Parisian investor about the similarities between Filipino and French colonial legacies, how both peoples understood the complexity of borrowed tongues. He switched to Indonesian without pause, laughing warmly as he recalled training in Jakarta, how the fighters there taught him that Bahasa and Tagalog shared roots deep as banyan trees, making brothers of archipelago, nations separated by arbitrary seas. Each language shift wasn't performance but homecoming. His Mandarin carried memories of Macau's neon-lit arenas where Chinese fans chanted his name. His French held echoes of Montreal press conferences where he'd surprised journalists by answering questions in their mother tongue. The Indonesian phrases, transported him back to sweltering gyms in Bali, where sparring partners became brothers, when he bothered learning their words for pain, for perseverance, for the shared dream of lifting families from poverty's grip. These weren't party tricks acquired for applause, but bridges built one vocabulary word at a time, each language representing thousands of hours listening, practicing, failing, trying again in pre-dawn darkness when his body screamed for rest, but his mind insisted on growth beyond physical limits. Language is respect, Manny said softly, his eyes moving across the diverse faces now watching him with transformed understanding, no longer seeing merely a fighter, but recognizing a student of humanity itself. Every tongue I learned opened not just doors, but hearts. My opponents' hearts when I spoke their childhood languages, my fans' hearts when I acknowledged their cultures, my country's heart when I proved Filipinos could master anything the world demanded. His voice carried the weight of a boy who'd transformed hunger into curiosity, poverty into motivation, trading his fists' brutality for words' precision. The ballroom's atmosphere had shifted entirely. The earlier mockery evaporated like yesterday's humidity, replaced by something approaching reverence, as these wealthy elites confronted a truth their privilege had obscured. That true sophistication isn't purchased, but earned through relentless dedication to understanding the human family in all its linguistic diversity. The silence held for 3 heartbeats, before movement stirred near the refreshment table. An elderly gentleman in a perfectly tailored barong Tagalog, his silver hair combed back with diplomatic precision, stepped forward, with tears gathering at the corners of his weathered eyes. Ambassador Rodriguez, a name whispered with reverence in Philippine Foreign Service circles, raised his champagne flute with a trembling hand that had signed treaties and brokered peace across 4 decades of service. You speak of bridges built by language. The ambassador's voice cracked with emotion that 50 years of professional composure couldn't contain. But these people don't know that your words have literally saved lives. The ballroom contracted around his revelation, every conversation dying mid-sentence as heads turned toward this unexpected testimony. Manny's humble expression flickered, with something between surprise and reluctance, clearly uncomfortable with where this story might lead. But the ambassador had already committed to unveiling a chapter the boxer had deliberately kept hidden from public glory. 12 years ago in Bangkok, during the constitutional crisis when protesters occupied government buildings, a group of Filipino workers became trapped in the crossfire between security forces and demonstrators. Ambassador Rodriguez continued, his diplomat's measured cadence giving way to raw memory. The Thai authorities couldn't communicate effectively with our terrified citizens. Translation services had collapsed in the chaos, and tensions were escalating toward violence with every confused exchange. Manny shifted slightly, his jaw tightening, as the memory clearly resurfaced, smoke and sirens, fear vibrating through telephone lines. Senator Pacquiao was there for an exhibition match, but when our embassy called, desperately seeking anyone who spoke Tagalog, English and Thai, he cancelled his training session and came immediately to the crisis center. The ambassador's voice swelled with pride that transcended professional diplomacy, becoming something paternal, grateful beyond articulation. For 9 hours straight, this man stood between languages and cultures, translating nuances that machine translation would have mangled into catastrophe, explaining Filipino desperation to Thai commanders and Thai security concerns to our panicked workers, Rodriguez testified, his words painting scenes these wealthy guests had never imagined their evening's entertainment capable of inhabiting. The ballroom's opulence felt suddenly obscene against this backdrop of genuine heroism, Manny's voice hoarse from endless repetition, his fighter's body forgotten as his linguistic precision became the only weapon that mattered, each correctly chosen word diffusing potential tragedy. 23 people came home to their families because Manny Pacquiao understood that championship belts mean nothing compared to human lives, that his gift for languages carried responsibilities heavier than any title. The ambassador's toast hung in crystal-clear air, thick with reconsidered assumptions, his final words landing like a judge's gavel. He never sought recognition for that night, never mentioned it in interviews, because for him, service wasn't performance. It was simply what representing the Philippines demanded when the world called. The ambassador's revelation settled over the ballroom like dawn breaking through storm clouds, transforming the space where mockery had flourished moments before into something resembling a chapel where truth demanded reverence. Khaled stood frozen in his humiliation, the architect of his own destruction, watching his carefully constructed superiority crumble like sandcastles before an unforgiving tide. His designer tuxedo suddenly felt like a costume, his wealth a hollow credential in the presence of substance he'd been too arrogant to recognize. The other guests studied their champagne flutes with newfound fascination, complicit witnesses to a judgment they'd enabled through their uncomfortable laughter. Khaled's throat worked silently, pride wrestling with conscience in a battle visible across his stricken features. Finally, with movements that seemed to cost him physically, he crossed the marble floor toward Manny, each step an admission that wealth couldn't purchase the wisdom to recognize greatness in humble packaging. His voice emerged barely above a whisper, loud enough only for truth. "Champion, I have shamed myself and insulted a man who towers above me in every measure that actually matters." Manny's expression held no triumph, no vindication's sharp edge, only the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the entire humiliating exchange, as if forgiveness had already been extended before apology was even offered. Khaled's apology gained strength as genuine remorse replaced defensive pride. "Please forgive my ignorance and arrogance. I looked at you and saw only stereotypes, made assumptions based on accent rather than substance." The millionaire's question emerged with authentic bewilderment that transcended mere politeness. "How did you find time to master 9 languages while becoming 8-division world champion, while serving your nation in Senate, while carrying the dreams of millions?" His incomprehension was absolute. Khaled's own achievements suddenly seeming small, inherited rather than forged, accomplishments of circumstance rather than will. Around them, the ballroom leaned forward collectively, everyone desperate for the answer to this impossible equation. Even the servers had stopped their practiced circulation, trays forgotten, as they witnessed reconciliation between worlds. Manny's hand extended not in conquest, but in connection, grasping Khaled's in the universal gesture that erases enmity through simple human contact. "Languages chose me before I chose them, brother." Manny's voice carried warmth that dissolved the millionaire's remaining defenses, addressing him now as equal, despite the chasm their interaction had revealed. His smile held understanding, born from having once been dismissed himself, from knowing intimately how assumptions cage both the judged and those who judge. When you grow up with nothing, you learn quickly that communication is the only currency that poverty cannot steal from your pockets. The wisdom landed softly, but penetrated deeply, a philosophy forged in deprivation that wealth could never teach. Khaled nodded slowly, tears threatening to breach the dam of masculine composure, recognizing grace he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Manny's voice filled the ballroom with the quiet authority of someone who had earned every word through sacrifice that gilded lives could never comprehend. Representing the Philippines meant I could never allow language to become a barrier between my people and the world that needed to hear our story, he continued, his gaze sweeping across faces now transformed from judgmental observers to captivated students. Each language I learned was a bridge I built with my own hands, connecting our islands to continents that once seemed impossibly distant, proving that a boy from General Santos could stand before kings and presidents not as a curiosity, but as an equal. His words carried the weight of a nation that had spent centuries being underestimated, dismissed, colonized, yet had produced champions who refused to accept the limitations others imposed. Poverty taught me that your voice matters only if others can understand it, so I made myself understood in every corner where Filipino dreams needed an ambassador. The revelation resonated beyond personal achievement, becoming a manifesto for every marginalized community that had ever been told their accent disqualified their intelligence, their origin predetermined their ceiling. The elderly ambassador approached, placing a weathered hand on Manny's shoulder in a gesture that transmitted generational pride, the torch of representation passing between those who had carried it faithfully. Khaled watched this exchange with the expression of someone witnessing redemption's true face, understanding finally that greatness measures itself not in accumulated wealth, but in bridges built and barriers demolished. Around them, Filipino staff members who had served invisibly throughout the evening now stood straighter, tears streaming unashamedly down faces that had forgotten permission to feel pride. In public spaces designed to remind them of their service positions, even the Arab guests found themselves moved by witnessing nationalism without arrogance, achievement without superiority, a champion who had conquered the world, yet remained unconquered by ego's corrupting whispers. Manny had accomplished what policy and diplomacy often failed to achieve, transforming perception through the simple, revolutionary act of exceeding every expectation while maintaining the humility that made greatness sustainable rather than fleeting. As the evening concluded, guests approached Manny not for photographs with a celebrity, but for conversation with a teacher, each interaction another language. Lesson in human dignity that transcended vocabulary. Khaled remained longest, the two men conversing quietly in Arabic about fathers and sons, about legacy, and what truly survives us when wealth turns to dust. The millionaire's transformation was complete, his earlier arrogance now seeming like a fever that had broken, revealing the decent man. Obscured beneath inherited privileges distorting lens. Through the floor to ceiling windows, Dubai's impossible skyline glittered with the ambition of nations racing toward futures they were building from sand and vision. Yet inside this ballroom, a different kind of architecture had been constructed, bridges of understanding built from the rubble of prejudice. Manny departed as he had arrived, without entourage or fanfare, but the space he left behind vibrated with altered consciousness, guests forever changed by the collision between their assumptions and his reality. The Philippines had sent not just a champion, but a prophet of possibility, living proof that circumstances of birth establish starting lines but never finish lines, that dignity outranks pedigree, that a nation of islands could produce an ambassador whose mother tongue became 9 tongues, whose fists had spoken in rings worldwide, but whose words ultimately delivered the more devastating victory. In boardrooms and palaces across the Middle East, the story would spread. Of the night, a Filipino boxer taught Arab royalty that true sophistication measures itself not in languages spoken flawlessly, but in respect offered freely, not in wealth displayed ostentatiously, but in bridges built generously. Manny Pacquiao had done what he had always done, what his impoverished childhood had destined him to do. He had taken every limitation the world placed before him and transformed it into a platform from which to elevate not just himself, but every Filipino who had ever been told their accent was inadequate, their dreams too ambitious, their worth too small to matter, on stages where power traditionally performed its exclusive rituals. What barriers have you transformed into bridges in your own life? Subscribe to witness more stories of champions who refuse to accept the world's limitations.